You are looking at a piece of meat that has been hanging at room temperature for over a year. No refrigerator, no freezer, no electricity of any kind. And in 3,000 years, nobody has ever improved on the method that made it. The Romans fed their legions with it. Spanish families built their entire culinary identity around it. And a single mistake in the process will ruin everything. But when you understand the one rule the old world charcutiers never broke, you will know exactly why this technique was worth more than gold. This is the art of curing, not the supermarket version loaded with chemicals, but the ancient method that fed Roman legions and built Spain's culinary identity. Today, with fragile supply chains and empty shelves, this forgotten knowledge matters more than ever. But the difference between a perfect year-long cure and a slab of rotting meat is one unbreakable rule. One the old world charcutiers guarded with their lives. The rule is deceptively simple. The meat must breathe, not sealed in plastic, not suffocated in a cryovac bag. The whole muscle must be left intact, coated in nothing but coarse salt, and hung in open air, where cool, dry breezes can pull moisture from the flesh, one molecule at a time. Break that rule by puncturing the muscle, by wrapping it too tight, by trapping humidity against the surface, and you do not preserve meat. You incubate hot. The Romans learned this from the Greeks, who likely learned it from the Egyptians. By 200 BC, Roman soldiers marched with dried pork legs slung over their shoulders, rations that would not spoil, from the banks of the Tiber to the walls of Gaul. They did not understand osmosis. They did not need to. They just knew that a ham submerged in salt for 7 days, then hung in a ventilated room for a year, became a food that could outlast a campaign. But the Romans did not perfect the craft. That would happen centuries later on a peninsula at the edge of the Mediterranean. In the mountains of Spain, farmers noticed something peculiar. The cold, dry wind that blew down from the peaks did more than chill their homes. It drew water from the hams hanging in their cellars with a gentle, even pull that no furnace could replicate. A pig leg, salted with nothing but sea salt, exposed to that mountain air for 18 months, then 36, then 48, transformed into something the world had never tasted. They called it jamón, and one particular variety, fed on acorns in the dehesa forests, carried fat streaked like marble and flavor that lingered on the tongue for minutes. The Spanish government would later write laws defining how it must be made, not because they wanted to control farmers, but because the method was so precise, so vulnerable to shortcut, that even a small deviation produced an entirely different product, one that spoiled, one that damaged the reputation of an entire region. The stakes were not just culinary. For families in Extremadura and Andalusia, a single jamón represented a year's protein. If the cure failed, the family went hungry, so they guarded the method the way a surgeon guards a sterile field. The leg must be rubbed with salt in a specific sequence. The exact number of days per kilogram must be observed. The hams must be washed with warm water, then hung where temperature drops at precisely the same rate. The salt penetrates inward. 5 stages, each with its own humidity window. Meat that was once living, bleeding, and full of water had to lose over 30% of its weight before it was considered stable. That took time, and time could not be rushed. Then, in the 20th century, everything changed. Refrigeration arrived, and with it the promise that any meat could be kept for weeks with a plug and a compressor. The old knowledge did not vanish overnight. It faded, slowly, from the kitchen to the factory. The cured leg was no longer a survival food, but a luxury item, a Christmas gift. a thing of nostalgia, and the multinational processors that stepped in saw an opportunity. If they could accelerate the cure from 12 months to 6 weeks, they could flood markets with cheap product and call it the same name. They did exactly that, and the results were predictable. Flavorless meat that leaked water, mold blooms that sickened entire batches, recalls that cost millions. The old charcutiers watched from their mountain villages and said nothing. They had seen this coming for decades, because the rule they guarded was not just about meat. It was about a truth that modern food systems had forgotten. A truth that brings us directly to the most dangerous mistake a home curer can make, and the one detail that separates a 6-month jamón from a 6-week disaster. Stay with me. The moment you decide to cure meat at home, you face a fork in the road. On one side is the whole muscle method, a ham, a shoulder, a loin, intact meat where the interior is sterile. Bacteria live only on the surface, and salt applied to that surface kills them or slows them enough for drying to finish the job. On the other side is ground meat, sausage, salami, chorizo. The moment you grind, you mix every surface microbe deep into the center of the product. And now the old rule reverses. The meat can no longer fend for itself. It needs a guardian, a chemical sentinel that patrols the interior even after the salt has done its work. That sentinel is sodium nitrite, or in traditional recipes, nitrate from celery powder or saltpeter, which converts to nitrite over time. Skip it, and you are gambling with the most lethal toxin known to science, Clostridium botulinum. The bacteria that produces it thrives in oxygen-free environments, exactly the kind created inside a sausage casing. It is tasteless, odorless, and a single teaspoon of its toxin could kill 100,000 people. In 1920, a botulism outbreak from improperly cured sausages killed 18 people in New York and Ohio. The headlines terrified the country and gave Congress the excuse to regulate curing salts for the first time. But that panic had an unintended consequence. It handed control of the cure to the very companies that had the least interest in the old ways surviving. By the 1950s, industrial meat processors had perfected a shortcut that made the traditional dry cure look like medieval alchemy. Instead of rubbing dry salt onto a ham and waiting a year, they injected brine directly into the muscle with rows of needles. The brine contained salt, sure, but also phosphates to trap water, sugar to mask saltiness, and sodium erythorbate to speed the curing reaction from weeks to hours. The ham swelled with retained moisture, sold by weight, and the factory turned inventory in 6 days instead of 6 months. The problem was that water stayed in the meat, so when a family brought that ham home and left it unrefrigerated, as millions did before refrigeration was universal, the moisture that the processors never removed became a breeding ground. Spoilage bloomed from the inside out. The very technology that promised abundance made the product more fragile than the ancient version, and no one told the customer. But here is the part that should make you angry. The food industry knew exactly what it was discarding because food scientists had already proved the superiority of the old method in terms a lab could measure. Water activity, or AW, is the decimal that predicts whether bacteria can multiply in a food. Pure water has an AW of 1.0. Fresh meat is 0.99. Below 0.85, most pathogenic bacteria stop growing entirely. Below 0.75, nothing grows. Nobody even argues about these numbers. They are the bedrock of every food safety textbook on Earth. A traditional Spanish jamón, after its full maturation cycle of 18 to 24 months, has a water activity of 0.72 to 0.78. A factory-made ham injected with brine and flash-dried in a week clocks in at 0.93. It is technically still a ham. It can legally be called that, but biologically, it is a ticking clock. And the difference between those two numbers, 0.78 and 0.93, is the difference between a product that can survive a warm summer on a hook and one that will become rancid without a refrigerator in 3 days. The old charcutiers did not know the term water activity, but they knew it in their hands. When they sliced a jamón and the surface was dry to the touch, never sticky, they knew it was stable. The process taught them what 1,000 pages of government regulation later obscured. And then, in the 1990, as researchers at the University of Extremadura made a discovery that should have changed everything. They analyzed the fat of acorn-fed jamón ibérico and found something no one expected. The fat was rich in oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fat that makes olive oil healthy. During the curing process, the fat underwent a controlled enzymatic transformation. It melted, oxidized, and recombined into volatile compounds that made the ham taste like nothing else on earth. But more importantly, the slow dehydration turned the fat shelf-stable in a way no hydrogenated shortening could match. A cured ham could sit in a pantry for 2 years and not only survive, but improve. The scientists published their findings. The industry ignored them. Because you cannot speed up enzymatic transformation. You cannot inject time. And that, right there, is the battleground where the last true charcutiers are fighting. A fight that took a man named Eduardo into a courtroom in Madrid in 2015, where he would argue that the word jamón meant one thing only, and a room full of corporate lawyers would try to prove him wrong. Eduardo stood before the tribunal in Madrid, a man who had spent 50 years making jamón the same way his grandfather had. He did not talk about chemistry. He talked about patience. He said the word jamón is not just a cut of pork. It is a contract, a promise that this meat hung in mountain air for at least 12 months, that it lost 30% of its weight to evaporation, that no needle ever pierced it. Break that contract, he argued, and you are selling a lie. The corporate lawyers disagreed. They said, a ham is a ham. Salt is salt. Process is irrelevant. Only the final product matters. They pointed to a label that said cured with sea salt and claimed the consumer would never know the difference. The judge asked a question that stopped the room cold. If the consumer cannot tell the difference, why are you fighting so hard to use the same word? What unraveled over the next 18 months revealed that this was never a local dispute. It was a proxy war over every traditional food in Europe. The European Union had built a system of protected designations of origin to shield products like Parmigiano Reggiano and Champagne from exactly this kind of dilution. But the meat industry argued that curing was universal, not regional, and that no one could own the word jamón. They spent 23 million euros on legal fees and lobbying. They flew in food scientists who testified that modern refrigeration made shelf stability irrelevant, that water activity was an aesthetic concern, not a safety one, that a ham injected with phosphates and dried in climate chambers was functionally identical to one aged in a mountain bodega for 2 years. And then a small research institute in Cáceres published a paper that blew a hole through the entire argument. They tested 36 commercial hams labeled as Serrano. The ones made the traditional way averaged water activity of 0.79. The industrial ones averaged 0.94. But that was not the finding that made headlines. The finding that made headlines was that 4 of the industrial samples contained detectable Listeria monocytogenes, a pathogen that should never survive the cure, and had not been found in a single traditional sample in 100 years. The industry's response was fast. They claimed the study was biased, funded by ham purists, but the damage was done. Because the very technology they claimed made the old method obsolete had created a product that was biologically more dangerous than the one it replaced. The hams that Spanish families had hung from kitchen rafters for centuries had never made anyone sick. The factory hams, sold as the modern safe alternative, had to carry a warning label: "Keep refrigerated," the words that should have been carved in stone. And yet, by the time the court ruled, the legal battle had become almost irrelevant. Something bigger had already shifted. Across Spain, a new generation of consumers had started reading labels. They learned to look for the black hoof mark that proved the pig was pure Iberico. They learned to scan for the words Bellota and Cibo de Campo. They asked butchers when the ham was slaughtered how long it hung. The old charcutiers, the ones the industry had dismissed as relics, found themselves treated like sages, and the knowledge they carried, the knowledge of exactly how salt and air and time conspire to turn muscle into something that can outlast a war, began to migrate out of the mountains, onto the internet, into YouTube tutorials, into the hands of people who wanted to cure a single pork leg in a spare bedroom with a humidifier and a prayer. And that shift, that quiet reclamation of a skill almost lost, connects directly to the single most important thing you need to know if you are standing in your own kitchen right now, holding a piece of meat, and wondering if you can really do this without a degree in food science. Because the answer starts with a number that the old charcutiers never wrote down, but every one of them knew. And that number is the difference between a ham you can hang for a year and a ham you cannot leave on the counter for a week. The number is 30. 30% weight loss. That is the line the old charcutiers drew with a simple scale and a piece of string. They would weigh the fresh leg the day it was salted. Then they would weigh it again every month. When the leg had given up a third of its original mass to the air, it was stable forever. No lab needed. No water activity meter. Just gravity and patience. That 30% threshold corresponds to a water activity of roughly 0.80 to 0.80 to 0.85. Below that, bacteria cannot replicate. Molds slow to a crawl. The enzymes that break down proteins and fats continue working, but at a pace that improves the meat rather than spoiling it. This is the biological truth that no factory has ever found a way to cheat. You can accelerate salt penetration with injection. You can dry a ham in a climate chamber instead of a mountain cellar. But you cannot force water out of muscle faster than the protein matrix will release it without cooking the meat. And cooked meat is not cured meat. It is roast pork, and it will rot in a week. Here is the method stripped to its essentials. Start with a whole muscle, a pork loin, a copper, a small leg. Weigh it. Record that number. For every kilogram of meat, apply roughly 35 grams of coarse sea salt. No iodine, no anti-caking agents. Pure sodium chloride, the same salt the Romans carried in leather pouches. Rub it into every crevice. Place the meat in a non-reactive container and bury it in the remaining salt. Leave it for 1 day per kilo. That is the equilibrium method, and it prevents oversalting. On day 2, the salt will have pulled a pool of liquid from the meat. That is the water leaving, taking blood proteins and trace sugars with it. Remove the meat, rinse it under cold water, pat it dry, Wrap it in cheesecloth or a cotton ham bag. Then hang it. The ideal environment is 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 70 to 75% humidity. A basement, a cellar, a wine fridge, with the door cracked. If the humidity is too low, the outside will dry into a crust that traps moisture inside. If it is too high, molds will bloom. But here is what the textbooks often fail to mention. A surface mold is not failure. White, powdery penicillin species are the signature of a healthy cure. The charcutiers call it the bloom. You wash it off with vinegar at the end. It protects the meat while the interior dries. If the mold turns black or slimy, something has gone wrong. Start over. After a month, weigh the meat again. A small cut, like a coppa, will hit 30% loss in 6 to 8 weeks. A whole leg takes 12 to 18 months. When it reaches the magic number, you slice into it. The interior will be deep red, firm and dry to the touch. The fat will be waxy and translucent, and it will taste like everything the industrial version forgot. In 2018, food scientist Maria Fernandez at the University of Córdoba conducted an experiment that should be taught in every culinary school. She placed a traditionally cured jamón and a factory-produced serrano ham on a shelf in her lab. No refrigeration, room temperature, ambient humidity. She tested them weekly for pathogens. The factory ham grew listeria on day 6. The traditional ham sat on that shelf for 24 months. It never showed a single colony of pathogenic bacteria. When she cut into it at the end of the study, it was not merely edible. It had improved. The fat had oxidized into deeper notes. The texture had grown silkier. The cure continued. The food became better with time. That is the difference. The old charcutiers understood, and the modern food industry cannot sell you. Time itself is an ingredient, and if you are standing in your kitchen holding a pork loin right now, it is the only ingredient you cannot buy at any price. There is something quietly radical about hanging a piece of meat in your own home and watching it transform without a single watt of electricity. It is a small rebellion against a system that wants you to believe everything expires, everything needs a barcode. Everything needs a barcode. Everything must be consumed within 3 days or thrown away. The old charcutiers never argued with the industry. They just kept making food that outlasted the critics. And now, in kitchens and basements across the world, that knowledge is being reclaimed one pork loin at a time. If this made sense to you, if you believe that some skills are worth preserving precisely because the world forgot them, then hit subscribe. And before you go, check the description and the first pinned comment. I have put together something special for people who want to take this further. A resource that walks you through the exact process we covered today, with measurements, tools, and the same rule the Romans trusted. The link is waiting for you down there. The food that lasts a year is not a myth. It is in your hands.